Alright, this video is about Bonnie Steinbock's paper, Speciesism and the Idea of Quality. And this is really a response to Peter Singer, who is sort of arguing against speciesism. So again, speciesism, I think it's a little hard to define, but it's this sort of prejudice or bias against non-humans in the same way that racism you could think of as something like a prejudice or bias against people of a different race. I mean, typically it's the way racism historically it's worked is you have sort of white people discounting the interests of non-white people, so-called. And in speciesism, mostly it's about the human beings discounting the interests of non-humans. So I want to talk a little more about Singer's view before I get to Steinbock's view. So pain is pain. So for Singer, he focuses, there are a lot of different interests. Humans have an interest in not dying, not suffering, not being confined, and so do, pigs and giraffes. They don't, they have an interest in not dying, not suffering, not being confined. But suffering is kind of the simplest case. Pain or suffering is kind of the simplest case. One way to think about it is if a human being is going to experience some pain, or a non-human is going to experience the exact same amount of pain, which is worse? Now, putting aside some technicalities such as differences in anticipation of the pain or memory of the pain, I mean, if you think about causing pain to, say, a cow, there's complications about it not understanding what's happening. You talk about causing pain to a human, there's complications about how the human being might remember it longer. Okay, so put those aside, and just imagine that we're talking about 50 units of pain delivered to a person experiencing 50 units of pain, a human being, or a non-human experiencing 50 units of pain. And it seems it's hard to see how 50 units of pain experienced by a human is worse than 50 units of pain experienced by a non-human. Now, if 50 units of pain, and that's a made-up thing, but let's imagine that's a lot of pain. Okay, if 50 units of pain is a lot of pain, then I don't want to experience 50 units of pain. And I guess I'd rather someone else experience it, if I'm being honest. But I don't think that it's objectively worse for me to experience it than for someone else to experience that amount of pain. And the same thought applies to, some human experiencing it versus some non-human experiencing it. It's just hard to see how the exact, amount of pain is worse if it's experienced by a human than by a non-human. So that's kind of what I'm getting at with the whole pain is it's a simple case. Killing is the more complicated case for Singer. He has this idea of treating like interests alike. So 50 units of pain for a human and 50 units of pain for an elephant, that's a like interest. But the killing of a human and the killing of an elephant, they're pretty different, right? So depending on the species, what it would be involved in killing it, what you're taking out of the world is rather different. And so Singer's discussion of killing really focuses on which approaches to life and death are speciesist and which ones are not speciesist. So it would obviously be speciesist to say that all human lives are more valuable than all non-human lives because the humans are human. That would be very obviously speciesist. But Singer says, wouldn't it be speciesist to say that the life of a self-aware being capable of abstract thought, planning, complex communication, and so on, that life is more valuable than the life of a being that doesn't have those capacities? That wouldn't be speciesist. It's not speciesist to think that the life of a typical human, right, a typical human has all those capacities. It's not speciesist to think the life of a typical human is more valuable than the life of a typical dog. And you might also think, I think this is a common idea, that the life of a dog or the life of like an orangutan or something like that is more valuable than the life of like a mouse or a squirrel, because we're talking about what's lost is a life that is, we might say, kind of richer, more complicated. It just seems like a bigger loss for like a chimpanzee or an orangutan to die than like a mouse or a squirrel to die. And that's also true of, say, a typical human dying versus, a typical animal from a different species. Now, of course, it would be speciesist if you claim that of two lives, one's a human and one's a non-human, but actually the non-human has more of these capacities of abstract thought and planning and so forth, right? So, there are, let's say, it's often in this debate brought up, and I guess I should mention, these writers are from the 1970s, and they tend to throw around, the R, I guess we call it the R slur, about, cognitively impaired people. And apparently that was just super normal back then to do. But nowadays we have different ways of talking about this. But I guess something like, profoundly cognitively impaired, human being. Let's maybe imagine that you have an infant that has some kind of genetic anomaly, and they're profoundly cognitively impaired. They may not rise to the level of, let's say, a chimpanzee or an orangutan or something like that. They might not rise to the level in terms of their ability to kind of communicate and have a kind of intellectual, awareness and so forth, these capacities. So if you say, yeah, but they're human, so their lives are more important, I think a lot of people would want to say that, of course, right? But in Singer's point, it's just like, well, that would be speciesist to say that. And I mean, that would be speciesist to say that, whether you can defend that or not, right? And whether you can defend speciesism is a big question for us. Okay, so try to kind of summarize then Singer's view that so if you're going to reject speciesism, then you're going to say that pain experienced by a non-human is just as important as pain experienced by a human. But when it comes to killing, it might be that certain lives are more valuable than other lives because, different individuals have different capacities, different abilities, and so that you can reject speciesism and still think that the typical human life is more valuable than the typical life of, say, a cat or a kangaroo or something like that. And similarly, you might think that the life of a mouse is less valuable than, say, the life of a chimpanzee. And it's not speciesist because you're not saying, aha, because of the species. You're saying because of the abilities, the capacities, the kind of life that it is. Okay, so hopefully that makes Singer's view pretty clear. And that'll let us go to Steinbock's defense of speciesism. So one claim that she is making is that there are certain capacities or abilities that all human beings have and then all non-humans lack. She mentions moral agency. This is the idea that we can be held responsible and we can sort of have a sense of right and wrong and do the right thing. The ability to reciprocate, which has to do with thinking about other people's interests, and they do something for us, we do something for them. The desire for self-respect. So I don't necessarily want to spend too much time on these, but the idea is there are certain capacities or abilities that all humans have and that no non-humans have. And then she wants to say that these capacities justify treating human interests as more important than non-human interests. That would be to justify speciesism, to say that our interests matter more, they're more important because we have these capacities and other animals don't. So I think that captures the sort of main claims that Steinbock wants to make. And maybe the first thing to say here is that, Singer would agree with part of this. We saw that Singer would say it's not speciesist to hold that the life of a being with certain capacities, like we could, mention the things Steinbock mentions, moral agency, the ability to reciprocate, etc. It's not speciesist to say that the life of being with those capacities is more valuable than the life of being without those capacities. And so Singer and Steinbock can agree that the life of a typical human being is worth more than the life of a typical dog. But Singer would deny that this justifies treating all human interests as more important than all non-human interests. And I think there's two reasons for this. Firstly, if we look at that claim that Steinbock makes, that there are certain capacities that all humans have that no non-humans have, Singer would point out that there just are not any capacities that all human beings have and all non-humans lack. Now, it's true that most human beings have these abilities. Most human beings have, moral agency and have certain, sophisticated cognitive, abilities and so forth, but not all. We could note that infants don't have these abilities yet, and most of them will developed them. But there's certain profoundly cognitively impaired humans who maybe will never have these capacities. And this is something Steinbock sort of admits later, that he tries to make this argument, all humans have this, so that's why our interests matter more. But it's really not all humans. You could, if you make a distinction between a person and a human, this is something we'll talk about with abortion, you could make the argument that every person has these capacities. I won't get into that now. Let's suffice it to say that pretty clear that not every human has these capacities, and so it's hard to have that as a basis for justifying treating every human a certain way if not all humans have these capacities. The second reason is that even if all humans had these capacities, it's not clear that would show that all human interests are more important than like non-human interests, especially with regard to pain. So imagine that all humans have moral agency and can reciprocate and so forth. They're all intellectually sophisticated, etc., etc. Would that show that their pain is more important? That you have this species that it's really smart and complicated and interesting, then you have the species that's like less smart, less complicated, less interesting. So the smarter species is going to experience a certain amount of pain, or the less smart, the exact amount of pain. Why would it be worse for the smarter species to experience that pain than the less smart species? The last thing I want to mention is Steinbock. She does have responses to all of what I'm saying here of what. So what have I've tried to sort of say, okay, here's Singer's view, here's Steinbock's claims, here's how Singer would respond to Steinbock's claims, and now I'll mention that Steinbock also has responses to what Singer is saying or would say, but I'll leave it up to you to decide how compelling her responses are.